So the Kansas Wichita Mission it's massive. It's almost the entire state of Kansas. It's basically the state of Kansas slid slightly to the left and slightly down. So it has a little bit of the eastern edge of the state of Colorado, Panhandle of Oklahoma, but it doesn't have the very eastern edge of the state of Kansas. So we don't have any of the Kansas City area. There's 5 stakes in Kansas, which, considering how big the area is not a lot, especially because about a third of the state is one stake, the Garden City stake, and it's all of out west. And it's, depending on where you're at, you could have wards or branches. The cities tend to have more wards, but when you get outside of the bigger cities being like Manhattan, Salina, Topeka, and like Wichita are kind of the biggest ones. Once you get outside of those, you get a lot more branches. There's not a temple in Kansas, and so that made it kind of interesting for how, if we did get a chance to go to the temple, they did a temple rotation, and so they would take one stake every quarter, so every other transfer. And so if you happen to be serving in that stake when it was their turn to go to the temple, then you got to go to the temple. So there were some missionaries that got to go 3 or 4 times on their mission, and then there are some missionaries that didn't go a single time. And so depending on where you were, if you were on the east side, so in like the Salina or Topeka areas, or Manhattan, you would go to the Kansas City temple. But if you're out west or in Wichita, you would go down to the Oklahoma City temple, which was kind of neat to be able to spend that much time kind of like pondering on your way to the temple and be able to spend the day there. But it definitely was hard not being able to go very frequently. There isn't a whole lot of church history in Kansas itself. Most of it is in Missouri. Something that was interesting is that many of the original buildings on Fort Riley, which is an army post about 2 hours north of Wichita, most of the original buildings were actually built by Mormon pioneers. There was a cholera epidemic, and so they ended up detouring off the trail. And so they were contracted to help build the buildings, and a lot of other people, when the cholera spread into that area, a lot of the other workers like quit, and they were like, oh, we're not going to finish this, we want to get out before we get sick. But the Mormon pioneers were like, no, we agreed that we were going to help build these buildings, and so we're going to stay and we're going to finish it. And so there's actually a plaque dedicated to them in like memory of what they did to help build the fort. So that's really the only notable thing about Mormon history that I really came across in my mission. So there predominantly is Spanish and there is English in the Kansas Wichita Mission, and a lot of the missionaries that are called are probably about half are Spanish speaking to our mission. Especially when you go out west, there is a lot of Spanish speakers out there, which is really cool. And part of the reason why, if you're English speaking, especially as a sister, you have a very slim likelihood of going out west, unless that's where you're supposed to go. For a lot of English sisters, we didn't go out west very often because there aren't a lot of purely English wards out there. And so it's very like bilingual in Kansas, which I know a lot of my friends that did get called Spanish, they were kind of like, what? Who speaks Spanish in Kansas? And a lot of people do. It's really, really interesting. There was a lot of times that if you're English speaking, like, if only we spoke Spanish right now, this would be so helpful. Especially when you'd get into pockets of heavily like Latin American or Hispanic cultures. Sometimes you'd knock on the door and they're like, no English. And you're just like, I'm pretty sure you speak English, but I will smile and try to pantomime and mimic Spanish as much as possible. So it was pretty cool though.